them with her faith, but taking action and doing and seeing their need and fulfilling that need, even though it meant that it put her in danger. So many great examples. And sometimes it can feel daunting to have all of these examples in front of us. We think of our own lives and our everyday. But what's so great about this passage is that it gives us instructions on how to apply this for our everyday. So where this letter brings us today is a matter of love, but is also a matter of salvation. So if you remember last time when we finished in verse 10, we just look at verse 10 together really quickly. By this it is evident who are the children of God and who are the children of the devil. Whoever does not practice righteousness is not of God, nor is the one who does not love his brother. Now, we've been reminded this over the course of the last few months, but here we're reminded again, and in this passage, the Apostle John, one of his goals in this letter is to provide assurance for us. For those of us that are in the true church, we're reminded that this is to give us confidence. This is for us to know our salvation even more than we already know it now. But it's also a warning for those that don't truly belong to him. You see, John today wants to give us more evidence that we're children of God or that we're not. Much in keeping with the pattern of John's letters, he's talking, explicitly about love and giving us this black and white picture. It either is or it isn't. There's no grey areas in between. And that's the beauty of these letters. You see, not only is John talking explicitly about love and how we are to love one another as believers, but in these passages, John is so black and white. And through that, God is expressing his love for us through John's writing. He's not giving us a chance to sit on the fence. Thank God that he is so loving to us, that he's willing to tell us the truth, even though it's harsh. That there is a black or a white and no grey area. A love from God that doesn't allow us to stay comfortable in our own folly, doesn't allow us to sit on the fence and not take positions and know where we stand and have assurance. No. So passages like verse 10 and passages like we're about to read today give us that assurance, give us that clarity. And thank God that he loves us so much to speak through his word in this way. So as we read in verse 11, we come to the beginning of this passage and it says here, For this is the message you have heard from the beginning. In other words, this is not the first time we have heard. This is not the first time these readers in the New Testament have heard this message. It's saying to them, this is the gospel that you know. And that's what it's saying to us as the church this morning. When John says this phrase, and he uses it in the verses before, and in this first letter of John, he's speaking to fellow believers that know the gospel. You might think of it in other words, or I like to think of it in other words as, let's take a step back. It's a phrase I used to hear a lot when I was just starting out in work. And come into a meeting, somebody might throw themselves into just talking about something. But you might hear somebody say, "Whoa, let's take a step back." And I like to see this phrase, "This is the message you've heard from the beginning," as saying just that. Let's just stop for a minute. In case you have got a little bit sidetracked in your life, in your walk of faith, spent so much time focusing on the wrong things, chasing after things that you think it's about, let's take a step back to the message that we heard right at the start, what it really was about, what it really is about, rather. And remember that this isn't a new teaching. This is the original foundation of the Christian life. For this is the message we've heard from the beginning. We might even say that love is the message. For it says in Matthew 22, 37 to 40, Jesus speaking to the Pharisees, he says this. And he said to the Pharisee, that was also a lawyer, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets." Love is the message. Part of John's emphasis on the fact that he is not teaching something new, but he's reminding them a basic truth which they have long known. You see, this cross that we so profess, that is the central point of human history for so many of us as believers, is because of God's love for us. John also writing that for God so loved the world. That's why he did what he did. Love is the message. And if we haven't understood love and how important it is, how central it is, then we might have missed the point. Sometimes we chase after the things and the words and the breakthroughs and this and that in our lives, and we try to overcome things. But ultimately, if we have outgrown love and understanding the love of Christ, we have misunderstood the gospel. It's because of love that we sit here today in freedom. And so this passage presents for us, in verse 12, an example of the opposite of that, to help us in that understanding. We read in verse 12, John says this: "We should not be like Cain, who was of the evil one and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his own deeds were evil and his brother's righteous." Sometimes to understand a notion like love is helpful to see the contrast and contrast it with the opposite, hatred. You see, John contrasts love that we have for one another with Cain's murder of his brother Abel. This is the one explicit reference of the Old Testament in John's letters. And why does he choose Cain? Why Cain in this passage? Well, Cain was the first person born on this earth under the curse of sin. Obviously, after Adam and Eve fell, Cain was born into sin. And his hatred towards his brother is an example that typifies the self-centered evil bent of the fallen human heart after the fall. Cain is an illustration of that. He displays that. And while our self-centeredness it seldom goes to the extreme of murder, the roots of hatred are there. And we see that in Cain. Hebrews 11 verses 4 says that Abel offered a better sacrifice by faith. And since faith is always a response to God's revelation, we must assume that God had revealed to Cain and Abel the proper kind of sacrifice that he required. The only difference was that Abel obeyed by faith, and Cain, in his defiance and disobedience, brought an unacceptable offering, knowing what he should have brought. And when his brother's offering was accepted and Cain's was rejected, his envy began to seethe. And those roots of hate and sin, that even though Cain was confronted and exhorted to repent, as it says in the word, Cain ignored even still that warning, and as a result, he slaughtered his brother. And this is a story that many of us already know. But notice this in this passage. John says to us about the why Cain did what he did. He explains even more so we understand that this notion of hate and why, and this opposite of love that Cain displayed. John says that Cain murdered Abel because his own deeds were evil and his brother's righteous. You see, hatred at its root is not just an emotion. It's not just an anger towards somebody. You see, it's a moral position. It's a moral posture that we can take. And Cain had the moral posture of hate more than just the emotion. You see, Abel's acts were righteous, and his evil heart, Cain's evil heart, it recoiled at that righteousness. It opposed it. It goes against the love and the obedience that Abel showed. So hate is the complete opposite of love, is what we're supposed to see today. That is why Cain did what he did, because his deeds were evil, because sin was in his heart, but his brother's acts were righteous. This is darkness hating light. This is darkness of trying to not mixing with light, not wanting the light. Which is why the next passage says to us in verse 13, "Do not be surprised then, brothers, that the world hates you." Much like Cain hated Abel. We might have watched, maybe on the internet, videos of Ray Comfort, the evangelist, videos where he's talking to people on the street, sharing the gospel, or seen debates maybe on university campuses about faith. It's so common to see that there's this innate opposition. We see it, don't we, sometimes? This innate opposition to Christians in those contexts. The world doesn't receive the gospel outside of God's Spirit, revealing it and allowing us to see the good news of Jesus Christ. So why shouldn't we be surprised? Well, we don't expect apple trees to produce grapes. You see, people of the world likewise cannot produce love for God's family. And this is what this passage is about. It's about love for fellow believers, love for God's family, God's children. And they can't do that because of their heart condition. The church can't make any sense to them. The Bible only feels like a book of rules to kill their so-called joy and so-called freedom. That is not truly that. You see, anyone who lives and breathes the gospel, therefore, is not someone to love, but a threat to their worldview. And we see that in these examples, don't we? We see it in our conversations sometimes and sometimes we have that fear that we're going to face opposition, but we shouldn't be surprised. You see, the gospel is a threat to the worldview that this world has, wanting to own themselves and be captains of their own fate, but ultimately destined for nothing but death and destruction. You see, they see it as a threat to their joy, a threat to their freedom. And even if they're not hostile, they dismiss the church as irrelevant. They pigeonhole and they're cynical, and that's the heart of hatred that does not love God's people. But as believers, we are different. Think about it like this. We have the difference between what might be in your home, a thermometer that you have on the wall, but a thermostat. You see, a thermometer it reflects the temperature of the room. It adjusts to its environment. It changes to what's going on inside it. It has no control itself. But a thermostat differently changes the temperature in the room. It controls what's around. You see, a Christian is called to be that thermostat, that light in darkness. It is a threat. We are threats to the darkness, to heat up the cold, as it were. And here is the thing, when we turn up the heat in our homes, sometimes there's friction. The cold air wants to stay. But do not be surprised when the world pushes back. But what we have is that message. And we are called to be the ones that bring that light to darkness, that bring that heat to cold. So know this, as Christians, all of us were born by nature all of us were born by nature with a desire to be our own gods. We were born fighting against anyone and anything that would disapprove of our own actions, doing what we want to do with our lives. But God convicts us. People warn us. God convicts us through people's warnings, and he warns us through his word. But by God's mercy, that is not the end of the story for us, and we thank God for that. It doesn't have to be the end of the story for anyone. And that's why Jesus came. Let's look at verse 14. We know that we have passed out of death into life because we love the brothers. We see what John is doing here, much like he does in so many of the other passages. This is a test, a diagnostic for us. It's a piece of evidence. John is not saying that we earn our salvation or we know that we have passed from death to life because we have earned it through the love and through the actions that we do, but rather he is saying that it is evidence. It's just what shows on the outside when we've already passed from death into life. Think about what it means. You see, John assumes, and the whole New Testament assumes that every person is already born into the world spiritually dead. Ephesians 2:1 says, you were dead in your trespasses and sins. Not just sick, not just struggling, totally cut off. Dead completely. So this is why John can use love as an evidence of salvation. It's not that love earns salvation. It is that love flows from our salvation. It is an inevitability, like water flows from a spring. Where there was genuine new birth, there was genuine love. And we're going to see the ultimate definition of that love in a moment. It may be imperfect in us, it may be growing, but it will be there. And Christ will work it through us as we continue to grow and as we continue to be sanctified by him. So here is a question that this verse puts to us, every single one of us today. Not only do you believe the right things, though you must, not only do you attend church, though we should, the question this verse asks us is there love in your life for other believers? Not just the grand love that we see in the examples of people in history, or even in this passage, but the everyday love that is worked out in our everyday, laying down our lives inch by inch for one another. A love that reaches, that costs us, that shows up for people in action, not just in the words that we say. You see now that there's an explicit warning also embedded in this verse that we dare not miss. Let's read again verse 14. It says, we know we have passed out of death into life because we love the brothers. Whoever does not love abides in death. See, this is not was in death, not came from death, but abides in death. This is right in present tense, living in it. John used this word abiding in previous verses, talking about abiding in Christ. Well, if we don't show love in action to our brothers and sisters in Christ, we are abiding in death. This diagnosis is sobering for us. We have not passed from death into life. We are still there, still in the place of spiritual death. And it should be a warning for us to take seriously this New Testament call to examine ourselves, to test our faith and to make sure that we are in Christ. This is not meant to destabilize our assurance. We are trying to make sure that we're on the right foundation here, trying to make sure that we believe the truth. And we go on and we read in verse 15 and 16, it says, "Everyone who hates his brother is a murderer, and you know that no murderer has eternal life abiding in him. But by this we know love, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brothers." And this is where the rubber hits the road, as it were. We've been taking somewhere now so breathtaking, this truth of the gospel. Up until this point, we're told what love is. It is that defining characteristic, is the evidence of God's children. He's also told us what love is not, the hatred that Cain showed for his brother Abel, opposing righteousness. But now we see in this passage, in this verse, where to look to understand love properly. We understand from this verse that the cross sets the standard. What he says here ought to arrest every one of us. By this we know love. You see, by this we know love. Not by culture, not by our feelings, or by the movies that we watch or the books we read, but by the cross, by the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. That is where love is defined. And that is the standard. Everyone else is measured against it. You see, we live in a world that thinks it knows a great deal about love. Love is the most talked about, sung about, most written about subject we can find in human history. It's all around us, people's ideas of what they think love is like. Every generation thinks it has discovered love. Every generation thinks it can define love. But here is what the world's definition of love almost always comes down to. Love is a feeling that makes me feel good. Love is the experience of being drawn towards someone or something. Love is warmth in my chest when things go well. You think about Hollywood and the way it defines love. Boy meets girl, there's chemistry, electricity. There's grand gestures, running through airports, standing outside windows in the rain. And all those are wonderful images. But because Hollywood is built on feeling and cannot survive cost, it shows us an incomplete picture. But we go to Calvary this morning. We go to that hill outside Jerusalem. We look at the Son of God nailed to that Roman cross. No butterflies or warm feelings, but sweat and blood and nails and a crown of thorns. And yet this is love. Not the picture that we're often shown. But by this we know love, that he laid down his life for us. The cross doesn't just illustrate love, it defines it. You want to know what love looks like? Don't go to Valentine's Day, don't go to the movies or the romance section in your local bookshop. Go to Gethsemane, where Jesus fell on his knees, praying, sweat and drops of blood. Go to Golgotha on the hill. Go to that cross. That is where love is defined. You see, there's an intentionality about the cross that we see here in this verse. You see, it says, by this we know love, that he laid down his life. He willingly laid it down for us. That is love in action, is it not? To feel the love of Christ laying down his life, it helps to see how utterly intentional it was. We see, look at what Jesus said after that violent moment where Peter tried to he cut off the ear of that soldier that tried to take Jesus in the garden. Jesus says to Peter, put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Do you not think I cannot appeal to my Father? And he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels? But how then should the scriptures be fulfilled that it must be so? You see, it's one thing, the details that, detail out Jesus' death and resurrection that was predicted in the Old Testament. But it's even more to see that Jesus himself was making choices every single day, precise choices to see that the scriptures would be fulfilled. There is an intentionality about the actions that Jesus takes. And that is what is defined for us. That is the model that we have of love. That is what Jesus is saying he's doing. He says, again in Matthew, I could escape this misery, but how then will the scriptures be fulfilled that it must be so? In other words, I'm not choosing to take the way out that I could take, because he could take that way out. But because I know the scriptures, because I am love, the embodiment of love, I know what must take place for my people, my children to be saved. And it is my choice to fulfill all that is predicted of me in the word. It is my choice every step of the way to love my people to the uttermost. Jesus was utterly intentional in his love for us. So let us be reminded of that and be assured of that this morning. Be encouraged. And that then is the new standard for us, isn't it? By this, we know love, that he laid down his life for us intentionally. And we ought to lay down our lives for the brothers. John doesn't stop at the cross, because obviously the cross is the beginning for us, isn't it? For so many of us. He says, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers. That word ought in the Greek, language is ophilomen, and it means to be obligated. So it means it's something that we owe. It's not just a suggestion for us this morning, saints. This is not an aspiration for those that are spiritually advanced among us. It's for all of us here today. We ought to lay down our lives. This is the debt that every single believer carries for his fellow believer. We have been loved already. And there was no price that we could pay to have paid that debt that was owed our lives, because Jesus already paid it. We have been loved, but we have been loved with a love that laid down his life. And that love is now to flow through us. And that is the message of this passage this morning. The cross sets the standard. But then we ought to also lay down our lives as well. Now, most of us will not be called to literally die for a fellow believer. But before we can relax, let's hear what verse 17 says next. Because John not just takes it from the kind of dramatic and the ultimate, obligation that we have, but he takes it from those kind of grand, kind of dramatic statement down to where we are right now in this Sunday morning, in verse 17. But if anyone has the world's goods and sees his brother in need, yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in him? You see, the cross is the standard. But here is a test of practical love. One that allows us to see how we can demonstrate it right here today, this morning. John is giving us, he's landing the plane, as it were, for us this morning. So he's giving us the theology for us to understand God's love and the cross and the laying down of our lives. But he's also giving us the ordinary, the Monday morning even, if you like. Into the mundane and the kind of routine of our lives, into the place where love must be tested. As we take this word with us this morning, let's take it into our Monday mornings and follow the example that's been set for us and the instruction that's been set for us. The scenario that John draws up here isn't sort of fantastic or exotic. He doesn't say that if your brother is in mortal peril. This is not like a Tom Cruise movie where it's always life or death. We know what our everydays are like. But John says this: what if someone has the world's goods and sees a brother in need? The practical things. Loving in action, not just with the things that we say. That is our everyday life. That colleague or friend who is struggling financially. The family in church who's also struggling. The widow who can barely keep her head above water. The single mother who needs practical help in her life. You see, John uses the term here, the closing of a heart against a brother in need. The word for closing here that's used in this passage in the Greek is splanchna, which refers to the bowels. It's like the inner organs. It was the kind of, in the ancient world, the seat of compassion. It's where we felt compassion is how we refer to those things. So it's that gut feeling of mercy. And it's that sense of, well, when you close off your heart, you're closing off that mercy, that seat of compassion that is within you as a believer. And that word to close means to shut. It means to lock. It's a willful, active movement. So it's not just the absence of generosity. It's a deliberate suppression of the compassion that we have as believers, that God has given to us, that flows through us, again, like a spring that we know in our Christian lives, right? But we have to actively and deliberately suppress that. And sometimes we do close off, but when we feel that tug of mercy, we shut down. We see the need, and sometimes we look away. We have the resource, and sometimes we keep it tightly to ourselves. We all know in this room, well, most of us know in this room, the story of the Samaritan, both adults and children alike. But let's zero in for a moment on the priest and the Levite. You see, Jesus told this story of the Good Samaritan about a man who was beaten and left for dead on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. And the priest came by and saw him. We know what he did. He passed on the other side. And the Levite came by, saw him, and passed on the other side. Jesus doesn't say that they didn't notice. He says that they saw and they passed. That is the closing of the heart. That is the active suppression of compassion. But the Samaritan, we know, in contrast, when he saw him, he had compassion. May that be our testimony going forward for today, more and more, every day for our fellow believers. The Samaritan's feet then, he didn't just have the compassion, his feet then followed with that compassion. And that is the difference that John is drawing for us here this morning. Then John asks a question that has no comfortable answer sometimes for us here. How does God's love abide in him? That person that closes off that compassion. How can God's love dwell and remain and make its home in a person who willfully closes their heart to a brother in need? And the implied answer in this passage is, it cannot. You see, God's love is not static. It's not just a theology or a concept for us to understand. God's love is willing and active. It's willing and active and working in our lives right now. And we ought to also show that love. Lay down our lives for one another in the everyday, sort of inch by inch. And that compassion that God produces in us from what he did for us on the cross and saving us, it also produces compassion that in our lives translates to concrete action. We think of a river. You see, a river flows. It's alive. It gives. It nourishes everything on its banks. You see scores of life of plants and animals living by a river. But you think and you contrast that with a swamp. You see, there's water there, but it has no way of getting out. And it sits there and over time becomes stagnant and black and breeds disease. It is no longer life-giving. John is saying that the person whose heart is always closed, who takes in the grace of God but never lets it flow outward towards people in need, is not that river, but rather that swamp. And we must ask ourselves honestly this morning, which one are we? This is not the prosperity gospel that says your generosity is a transaction that will be matched by material blessings. This is not that. Let's be clear on that this morning. This is a gospel that says if you have been genuinely changed by grace, that grace will make you generous, and you will expect nothing in return. You cannot receive extravagant, costly, self-giving love that God gave for us on the cross and remain fundamentally unchanged in how we treat other people. So, back to this passage, this final verse. Little children, let us not love in word or talk, but in deed or in truth. This goes to our third and sort of final point in the notes in your handout this morning. Love is not proven by what we say, but what we do, as we heard this morning in the example that I gave. We see here the kind of pastoral address of John again. He wants us to hear this. Little children. He gives us a final decisive standard. That it's not word or talk or the things that we say, but rather our actions and truth. And truth. See, both of those things matter. There are some people who talk about love beautifully. They write songs about love beautifully and do nothing. They are full of good intentions. And I am one for certain that has been guilty of that. They say the right things in the right moments, and when there is concrete need, when the love costs something, they're nowhere to be found. John says that is not love, that is noise. Like clanging cymbals, as Paul also said in 1 Corinthians 13, when talking about love. John also says the truth, not just our actions. Because you see here, there can be activism without understanding the truth, without doctrine, and that is equally as hollow. There are people who give generously and serve sacrificially, but with no reference to God, no reference to the truth of the gospel. You see, no proclamation of the gospel, no eternal dimension to that love. Because you see here, activism and social good is nothing without an understanding that the truth matters and the gospel matters. The eternal destiny of the person sitting next to you this morning matters. And for us to share that is the ultimate act of love, and to not withhold that. Which is why we should love in action and in truth. In what we say and what we share in the truth. You see, an action without truth is just charity. It starts and it ends there. Charity without Christ is just temporal. It's temporary, it doesn't last. But love that is grounded in the truth of the gospel, love that serves, that speaks, and has actions, that meets needs and points to Jesus, you see, that is eternal and everlasting love that endures through into eternity. It echoes into eternity. As we see people saved and come to a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. The love for God, the love of God for us is expressed on the cross. And it should produce in us a love for one another. That's what we're saying this morning. So let's be encouraged and be assured of that. If you see that, be assured of that truth in your life and make a commitment once again this morning to love people in action. John has given us a progression that runs from the grand to the concrete everyday of our lives. He started with the love of God that was declared at the very beginning, to love one another. He showed us the dark alternative in Cain in this passage, and what a heart shaped by envy and hatred produces, eventually what the roots of that are. He showed us that love for brothers is the pulse of our heart, of the heart that has been regenerated by Christ, and showed us that the cross is the definition of and the standard of that real love. And now he asks me this morning, not just theologically or abstractly, but practically, what are you going to do with it? So a few questions for us this morning that we can apply to our lives. Where has your love become passive? Where have you retreated from the costly acts of love? Where have you substituted sympathy for sacrifice, rather just saying, I hope all is well with you, and then just did nothing with it? Or rather, even where has your love become conditional? Remember, the cross was not conditional. He laid down his life intentionally for those that actually nailed him to the cross. And that is our standard. And finally, who is God placing before you this week? You might have been sitting here this morning, hearing this word, thinking about a need that somebody in your life has. And I've written some things to help us for us this week. To commit to pray about this passage and for God to enable us to love in action and in truth. And if you want to, you can write this down. You can write it in your phones, write it on your piece of paper. Let's do this after we break and before we even go to fellowship. If you've got a pen, write down the person that you're going to love this week. A need that you might want to meet this week, and an action that you're going to take. And let this be a continuous habit for us every week to think in this way. 1 John chapter 4 verse 19 says, we love because he first loved us. So we thank God for his wondrous love. And let us love in action and in truth, not just in what we say. Amen.